Hello, everyone. I have finally finished David Copperfield in its entirety, all 877 pages of it, and it's quite a long book. I think it is the eighth Dickens book that I've read. Let me see. I may be leaving some out, but I think if I'm counting, I've read A Christmas Carol, of course, and then I read Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, Our Mutual Friend, um, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, um, Hard Times, The Old Curiosity Shop, and now David Copperfield. And now, obviously, I'm going to have to leave a lot of my thoughts out in order to keep this, a rather relatively short video. But I will say that I didn't enjoy David Copperfield quite as much as books like A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. I mean, I still think it's a good book overall, but mainly because I felt that there wasn't really a central conflict in David Copperfield. It was mainly about David Copperfield going through life, having various experiences. One conflict would arise and then be resolved, and another conflict would pop up, and therefore the book lacked a certain amount of tension that was in books like A Tale of Two Cities and David Copperfield. Not David Copperfield and Great Expectations. And so I just felt that because there wasn't really a central conflict, there wasn't quite as much tension in the book. But I understand that this was a narrative where about David Copperfield's upbringing and how he came came to be who he is. And although the Great Expectations was like that, but it had more of a linear narrative. I think because when Dickens wrote David Copperfield, he was writing in bi-weekly installments, things that would come out every 2 weeks instead of monthly, and therefore Dickens wrote books that were 800 pages like this, but also books that were 400 pages. But I feel that his 400-page books are more coherent and streamlined, whereas his 800-page books, you could cut some things out and you really wouldn't lose anything. And but I do feel But now I'll get to the positives. One is that I felt that David Copperfield spoke with a very personal voice. And of course, it's very clear that David Copperfield, for the most part, is Dickens. That they even talk about how he's a famous writer and he has a career, although they won't elaborate on it because I don't think Dickens wanted to I don't think Dickens wanted to compare himself too closely with David Copperfield. But to me, it's very obvious that is who he is talking about. That he is writing about himself essentially. And but I feel that the first person narrative really helped you get into the mind of David Copperfield. That you really felt you could personally identify with him and his struggles, especially at the beginning when he was a child, being forced to work in a factory and being abused by the adults around him, none of whom really seemed to care about his welfare. But now there are a multitude of conflicts in this book, and I won't be able to mention all of them. But one relationship that is really key in the book is his relationship with his best friend from school, Steerforth, who who David idolizes in a way that's somewhat unrealistic, and ultimately later on Steerforth though ends up betraying him and ends up running off with a girl who was betrothed to someone else, and that creates a riff in their relationship, and there will be spoilers, by the way, in this review. So if you don't want anything spoiled, then don't read all the then don't watch the entire video. But ultimately, he never really resolves his friendship. That he never really reconciles his friendship with Steerforth, and probably the best sequence in the book is where you have there's this tempest, this storm sequence where David Copperfield is watching this ship slowly sink, and it's a very violent sequence during which Steerforth and the character of Ham, who is the man who is the man who was betrothed to the girl that Steerforth stole, where Ham tries to rescue Steerforth from the sinking ship, but they ultimately end up dying together. And to me, that was a very climactic and a very descriptive scene. You could really, it was so descriptive that you could feel the rush of the water, the rain, and and it was a very immersive. And to me, that was Dickens at his very best. And then, of course, you had the character of Dora, who David Copperfield married at first as his wife, but Dora was all I never really liked Dora personally because she came off as rather daft and just not very bright, and she had a childlike quality that I just found to be rather distasteful, mainly because I guess I'm just personally not a fan of childlike qualities in people. And even David Copperfield eventually realized that he regretted marrying her because he couldn't really talk to her about his writing or anything that he was doing because she didn't understand it. But of course, it was still tragic though when Dora ultimately faded away. And he described that this is a very profound piece of description when he talks about her fading even in her bloom and how she ultimately and so Dora ultimately passed away, but he had but Copperfield had an attraction to this girl named Agnes who he had grown up with, but he thought of her more as a sister than anything else. But then later on, he realized that he actually had romantic feelings for her, and ultimately they end up getting together at the end, and it was a very powerful moment actually when especially she confessed her love for him, and it made it where, and I think ultimately the book should have ended there but there was an epilogue that was tacked onto it that I don't really think was necessary. That I think that was the emotional climax of the book, that Copperfield, after all those years, finally found salvation and rest in her, and he Dickens uses this poignant phrase about how Agnes is pointing upwards towards heaven, that she's ultimately pointing upwards towards happier, more joyous times, a more optimistic future. And so Dora's, I mean not, and so Agnes. If I said Dora a few times, I meant Agnes, but but Agnes is ultimately a reflection of angelic purity in a sense, and that she ultimately becomes David Copperfield's salvation. And so in that sense, that relationship is the heart of the book. You also have some conflicts between between Mr. Micawber, who is a character some of you might know, and Uriah Heep, who is trying to swindle Agnes's father, and so that's a subplot in the book. Heep turned out not to be as great of a threat though as I thought he was going to be. He went down and lost rather easily. Um, but but yeah, the book doesn't have one central conflict. There are various conflicts that are weaved and threaded together throughout the book, and ultimately the book is about um, David Copperfield's maturity and how he is able to ultimately find rest and salvation um, in Agnes, and he is able to move forward with his life after all of the dark things that occurred early in his life. And so it was an interesting book because it gave you an insight into the mind of another human being in a very profound and introspective way, to where you could empathize with David Copperfield on a very deep level. And I think that's what great fiction does, is that it makes you empathetic towards other people. It makes you sympathize with people whose lives you may have not known anything about otherwise. So that's what I think is so great about David Copperfield. So that is my review.